Listen carefully, Europe. I just outlawed your euro and dollars in all 54 African nations, and from the corpse of your paper slavery rises gold currency that will crush you. You thought we'd worship your worthless paper forever. You believed colonization broke us permanently, and Africans would stay poor while you printed toilet paper called money and robbed us blind. You were wrong. I created an African gold currency. Every Western bank operating here gets one warning. Abandon your paper, or I seize everything you own tonight and throw you out bleeding. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I studied Burkina Faso's monetary system and discovered we weren't actually independent. We claimed sovereignty across 54 African nations, flew our own flags, ran our own governments. But our money? Our money told a different story. The CFA franc we used was printed in France, backed by euros held in French treasury, controlled by policies set in Paris. We were monetarily colonized while pretending to be free. That lie ended when I decided it ended. The CFA franc system was designed during French colonial rule, and these parasites barely changed it after we supposedly gained independence. 14 West and Central African countries still use CFA francs pegged to euros at fixed rates. We were required to deposit 50% of our foreign reserves in French treasury. France guaranteed convertibility but controlled our monetary policy through this theft. We couldn't print our own money. We couldn't set our own interest rates. We couldn't control our own monetary destiny. We were slaves calling ourselves free nations. I calculated the costs this exploitation imposed on Burkina Faso. We held $1.8 billion in reserves. That meant $900 million sat in French treasury earning minimal interest while France used our money freely. The fixed euro peg meant European central bank decisions set our monetary policy regardless of what Burkina Faso's economy needed. When the euro strengthened, our exports became less competitive, and we suffered. When Europe faced inflation, we imported their price increases, and our people starved. We bore all costs, while France captured all benefits. That's not partnership. That's robbery. The system also enabled massive capital flight from Burkina Faso to Europe. Because CFA francs were freely convertible to euros and backed by French guarantees, wealthy Burkinabe could easily move money to European banks. $2.3 billion in capital had fled Burkina Faso to France over the previous decade through this mechanism. Our savings enriched French banks while Burkina Faso starved for investment capital. We were funding French prosperity with African poverty. I recognized this monetary colonization had to end if Burkina Faso and the other 53 African nations would ever be truly sovereign. Real independence required controlling our own money, setting our own monetary policy, keeping our wealth in Africa rather than shipping it to Paris, Frankfurt, or Washington. I began planning how to break free from the CFA franc system and establish genuine monetary sovereignty for all of Africa, not gradually, not diplomatically, immediately and completely. I consulted with monetary economists who weren't corrupted by Western training, central bankers from truly independent African countries, gold mining executives who understood Africa's real wealth. I studied how other nations had successfully escaped monetary colonization. I analyzed Burkina Faso's gold production capacity and Africa's collective gold reserves across all 54 nations. I developed a plan to create an entirely new monetary system based on African gold rather than European paper lies. Burkina Faso was Africa's fourth largest gold producer, extracting over 60 tons annually. Across all 54 African nations, we produced approximately 800 tons of gold per year. That's nearly 30% of global gold production coming from African soil. We literally mined the wealth that backed global currencies, yet we used paper money printed in Europe and America. Let that sink in. We dug gold from African soil, shipped it to Europe, and they printed paper money backed by our gold that they then loaned back to us with interest. The scam was so obvious once you stopped pretending it was normal. I designed a gold-backed currency system where one unit would be backed by a fixed weight of physical gold held in Burkina Faso's central bank. Unlike the CFA franc backed by euros held in France, this new currency would be backed by actual gold held on African soil under African control. The gold standard would prevent the currency devaluation and inflation that plagued paper currencies when governments printed unlimited amounts to finance wars and bail out corrupt banks. The plan required building substantial gold reserves before launching the new currency. I directed Burkina Faso's gold mining revenues to accumulate reserves rather than converting to CFA francs that enriched France. We secretly accumulated 18 tons of gold reserves worth approximately $1.2 billion. This provided sufficient backing to launch a new currency and begin circulation while continuing to build reserves from ongoing mining production. Every ounce stayed in Burkina Faso. Every gram belonged to us. I also needed political support from other African nations if this new currency would become continental standard rather than just Burkina Faso's experiment. I began confidential consultations with leaders across all 54 African nations, explaining the benefits of a gold-backed African currency and proposing coordinated adoption. The response was overwhelmingly positive from countries tired of monetary exploitation through CFA francs, dollars, and euros. Everyone was tired of the theft. They just needed someone to lead the rebellion. I secured commitments from 23 African nations representing all regions of the continent to adopt the new gold-backed currency. The diverse coalition included major economies like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, along with smaller nations that recognized gold-backed money would serve their interests better than colonial paper currencies. The continental support meant the new currency would launch with critical mass, ensuring viability and stability. 24 nations moving simultaneously. Europe couldn't stop that. I scheduled the announcement, calculating that simultaneous action by 24 African nations would create too large a movement for Europe and America to suppress individually. We prepared detailed implementation plans, established gold reserve requirements, created currency exchange mechanisms, coordinated messaging. The secrecy was absolute because we knew if Europe discovered our plans in advance, they would sabotage the launch, they would threaten, they would bribe, they would orchestrate coups, so we told them nothing until it was too late to stop us. I addressed the nation of Burkina Faso in a televised speech that shook the world. I announced that effective immediately, Burkina Faso was banning the euro and dollar from all domestic transactions. The CFA franc was abolished. Dead. Gone. In its place, we were launching the African gold dinar, a new currency backed by physical gold held in Burkina Faso's central bank. 1 gold dinar equaled 0.15 grams of pure gold. The currency's value was transparent and verifiable. No central bank could print unlimited gold dinars. No politician could devalue our savings through inflation. Our money was real. I explained that 23 other African nations were simultaneously adopting the gold dinar, creating an immediate monetary union of 24 countries across all 54 African nations. I declared that all government transactions, all domestic commerce, all wages and prices in Burkina Faso would now be denominated in gold dinars rather than CFA francs, euros, or dollars. I announced that we had 18 tons of gold reserves backing the new currency, with more being added daily from mining production. I showed the gold on television so people could see their wealth was real, not paper promises. The speech was defiant and unapologetic. I explained exactly how the CFA franc system had exploited Burkina Faso for decades, keeping half our reserves in French treasury, tying our monetary policy to European interests, enabling capital flight that impoverished our nation. I declared those days were permanently over. Burkina Faso controlled our own money now. Backed by our own gold, managed for our own benefit, monetary colonization had ended, not through negotiation, through declaration. Within minutes of my speech, the other 23 African leaders made identical announcements in their countries. Nigeria's president declared the naira was being replaced by gold dinars. Ghana abandoned the cedi, Kenya ditched the shilling, Egypt left the pound. South Africa replaced the rand. Across the continent, 24 nations simultaneously declared monetary independence from Western paper currencies and adopted gold-backed African money. The coordination was perfect. The execution was flawless. Europe woke up to discover they had lost monetary control over 24 African nations overnight. The European response was immediate shock and fury. The French president called my office within an hour, demanding I reverse the decision and restore the CFA franc. I let the phone ring. The European Central Bank issued a statement calling the gold dinar reckless and warning of economic catastrophe. I laughed at their lies. The IMF threatened that abandoning convertible currencies would isolate African economies. I ignored their threats because we had alternatives and European approval was no longer required or desired. European exchanges, banks, and businesses operating in Burkina Faso faced an immediate crisis. Their accounts were denominated in CFA francs that no longer existed. Their profits couldn't be converted to euros because we banned euro transactions. Their business models assumed they could extract wealth from Burkina Faso and convert it to European currencies freely. That system had just collapsed completely. Their exploitation had ended. Their comfort had shattered. I gave European institutions operating in Burkina Faso a simple choice. Convert your operations to gold dinars. Conduct business in African currency. Keep your wealth in African banks. Operate under African monetary sovereignty. Or leave Burkina Faso within 30 days. There would be no third option of continuing to extract wealth in euros. The era of monetary exploitation had ended permanently. Choose adaptation or exile. I didn't care which. Most European businesses initially refused, believing I would back down under pressure from France or the EU. They assumed Burkina Faso couldn't actually sustain an independent currency and would be forced to restore the CFA franc within weeks. They were wrong about everything. The gold dinar launched successfully, maintained stable value because of gold backing, gained rapid acceptance across Burkina Faso as citizens recognized we finally controlled our own money. People trusted gold more than they had ever trusted French promises. 1 month after the launch, the gold dinar was functioning smoothly across all 24 participating African nations. We had established exchange rates between our currencies and gold dinars, created clearing mechanisms for trade, built payment systems that enabled seamless transactions. The currency maintained stable value tied to gold prices rather than fluctuating based on European central bank decisions or dollar movements. We controlled our money. We managed our economy. We served our interests. The practical benefits became visible immediately. Burkina Faso's government could now implement monetary policies appropriate for our economic conditions rather than being forced to match European policies. When our economy needed stimulus, we could adjust interest rates and money supply based on gold reserves rather than waiting for ECB decisions that served Europe. When we faced inflation, we could tighten policy independently. The recovered monetary sovereignty enabled economic management that served Burkina Faso's interests instead of France's profits. Capital flight reversed dramatically. Wealthy Burkinabe who had moved money to European banks began repatriating funds because gold dinars backed by physical gold offered better security than euros backed by European Central Bank, promises and political manipulation. Over $1.1 billion in capital returned to Burkina Faso's banking system. That money provided investment funds for development projects that had been starved for capital under the CFA system. Our wealth was finally staying home. The 30-day deadline I gave European institutions expired. Approximately 40% of European businesses operating in Burkina Faso chose to convert operations to gold dinars and continue under African monetary sovereignty. They recognized that access to Burkina Faso's markets and resources justified adapting to our currency system. These companies transferred their accounts to gold dinars, began paying workers in African currency, accepted that profits would remain in African banks rather than being freely converted to euros. They bent their knee to African sovereignty. But 60% of European institutions refused to accept gold dinar operations and chose to leave Burkina Faso instead. Major French banks closed their Burkina Faso branches rather than operating in African currency. European retailers shut down stores. French agricultural companies abandoned operations. They believed their departure would cripple Burkina Faso's economy and force us to restore the CFA franc and beg them to return. They believed we needed them more than they needed us. They were catastrophically wrong. I watched them leave with satisfaction rather than concern. Their departure created opportunities for African businesses to fill the gaps. Burkinabe banks expanded to serve customers abandoned by French banks. Local retailers opened stores in spaces vacated by European chains. African agricultural companies took over land and operations that French firms abandoned. The European exit transferred economic control from foreign to domestic hands. It strengthened, rather than weakened, Burkina Faso's economy. Their departure was the best thing that ever happened to us. 2 months after banning the euro and dollar, Burkina Faso's economy was growing faster than it had under the CFA franc system. GDP growth accelerated to 7.2% annually as recovered monetary sovereignty enabled pro-growth policies. Unemployment fell as African businesses expanded into spaces vacated by European companies. Investment increased as repatriated capital funded projects. The transformation demonstrated that European institutions had been extracting wealth rather than contributing to development. We were richer without them. The success in Burkina Faso and the other 23 initial gold dinar nations attracted attention across all 54 African countries. Leaders who had been skeptical about abandoning Western currencies observed that the gold-backed system worked. Citizens saw their neighbors prospering with monetary independence. Additional African nations approached me about joining the gold dinar monetary union. The movement was spreading beyond my initial expectations. I welcomed the expansion and helped the new countries establish gold reserves, convert their monetary systems, and integrate with existing gold dinar infrastructure. The monetary union grew to 38 African nations, representing over 70% of the continent's 54 countries and 85% of Africa's GDP. The gold dinar had become Africa's dominant currency, displacing CFA francs, dollars, and euros across most of the continent. Europe's monetary empire over Africa was collapsing. Listen carefully, Europe and America. 38 African nations have now banned your currencies, and from the ruins of your monetary empire rises continental gold-backed fury you cannot contain. You thought the CFA franc collapse was temporary. You believed we'd crawl back begging for euros and dollars when our economy collapsed. You were dead wrong about everything. I expanded the gold dinar from 24 to 38 nations in 4 months. I proved gold-backed African currency works better than your worthless paper. I shattered your monetary control over 85% of Africa's economy. Your banks fled. Your businesses abandoned us. Your threats failed completely. This is your intensified final warning. Stop interfering with African monetary sovereignty, or the remaining 16 nations join tomorrow and Europe loses Africa completely and forever. We trade in gold across 38 nations now, while your paper currencies collapse in value. Sanction us and all 38 nations simultaneously seize every European and American asset on African soil, triggering the greatest wealth transfer in history. Try economic warfare and watch 54 unified African nations expel every Western institution permanently. Your colonial currencies die across Africa today. We built monetary freedom with our gold. Your exploitation ended. We prosper now while you panic. The expansion to 38 nations created a true continental monetary system that terrified Western financial institutions to their core. The gold dinar zone included Africa's largest economies like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya, along with resource-rich nations like the Democratic Republic of Congo with its cobalt and Angola with its oil, plus rapidly growing markets like Ethiopia, Ghana, and Tanzania. Combined GDP exceeded $3.8 trillion, making our monetary union larger than the entire British economy. Population surpassed 1.1 billion people, representing a massive consumer market that suddenly operated under unified currency controlled entirely by Africans. Gold reserves backing the currency totaled over 180 tons, worth approximately $12 billion, sitting in African vaults under African control, not European treasuries. This wasn't an experiment anymore. This was Africa's new monetary reality that would never be reversed. Western banks watched in horror as their centuries of monetary control over Africa evaporated within months. Goldman Sachs issued internal memos warning clients about losing access to African currency markets. JP Morgan Chase calculated they had lost over $8 billion in annual revenue from African currency trading and conversion fees. Deutsche Bank closed entire African currency trading desks because there was nothing left to trade when 38 nations used the same gold-backed currency. BNP Paribas faced margin calls as their CFA franc holdings became worthless overnight. These institutions had built empires extracting wealth through currency manipulation, and I had just destroyed their business model permanently. The European Central Bank convened emergency meetings trying to calculate the full damage to euro dominance. They discovered that African nations had held approximately $140 billion in euro reserves before the gold dinar launch. After 38 nations switched to gold-backed currency, euro reserves held by African central banks had collapsed to just $18 billion. $122 billion in euro holdings had been liquidated and converted to gold or gold dinars. That represented massive selling pressure that had weakened the euro by 7% against other major currencies. Europe's currency was bleeding because Africa had stopped subsidizing it. The Federal Reserve faced similar calculations about dollar dominance collapsing across an entire continent. African nations had previously held approximately $230 billion in US dollar reserves. After 38 nations adopted gold dinars, dollar reserves in African central banks totaled just $71 billion. $159 billion in selling pressure had hit dollar markets. The dollar had depreciated by 4% as a direct result of African monetary independence. America's ability to print unlimited money and export inflation globally was being challenged by countries that chose gold over paper promises. We established the African Gold Reserve Bank to manage the monetary union and ensure our independence would be permanent and irreversible. The institution set gold reserve requirements mandating that every gold dinar in circulation must be backed by at least 0.1 grams of physical gold held in member nation vaults. This prevented any government from printing unlimited currency and devaluing everyone's money through inflation. The gold backing was real, verifiable, and enforced through quarterly audits conducted by rotating teams from member nations. No trust required. Just gold you could see and count. The African Gold Reserve Bank coordinated monetary policies across member nations to ensure stability while respecting each country's sovereignty. We established interest rate corridors rather than fixed rates, allowing individual nations to adjust based on their economic conditions while preventing destabilizing divergence. Nigeria could run slightly higher rates if facing inflation pressures. South Africa could lower rates if needing economic stimulus. But the corridor system prevented any nation from implementing extreme policies that would destabilize the entire monetary union. We balanced sovereignty with stability. The bank managed currency exchange rates between gold dinars and non-member currencies, protecting African nations from manipulation. When Western hedge funds attempted to attack the gold dinar through massive short selling, the Reserve Bank coordinated buy orders from all 38 member nations simultaneously, crushing the speculators and forcing them to cover positions at massive losses. George Soros tried to break the gold dinar like he had broken the British pound. We broke him instead, costing his fund over $2 billion in a single week. After that, speculators stopped attacking African currency because they learned we had the gold reserves and coordination to destroy them. The bank provided liquidity during temporary imbalances between member nations, preventing the currency crises that had plagued African countries under Western monetary systems. When seasonal agricultural patterns meant Ghana needed short-term liquidity, the Reserve Bank provided gold dinar loans backed by Ghana's gold reserves without imposing the structural adjustment conditions that IMF loans always carried. When Kenya faced temporary trade imbalances, liquidity support came from fellow African nations through our institution rather than requiring Kenya to beg Washington or Brussels for assistance that came with sovereignty-destroying conditions. Unlike the IMF or European Central Bank that imposed external control and served Western interests exclusively, the Gold Reserve Bank was owned and operated by African nations for African interests without any outside interference. Every member nation had voting rights proportional to their gold reserves contributed to the system. Nigeria, with substantial reserves, had more votes than smaller nations, but even the smallest members had voice and veto power over major decisions. No Western countries had any votes. No Western banks had any influence. No Western interests were considered in our decisions. Every decision served us. Every policy benefited Africa, not Europe, not America, Africa. The governance structure ensured that monetary policy would serve African development rather than Western wealth extraction. The Reserve Bank's mandate was explicitly to maintain currency stability, promote intra-African trade, and support sustainable economic development across all 54 African nations. That contrasted sharply with the European Central Bank's mandate to maintain price stability for European economies regardless of impacts on Africa, or the Federal Reserve's mandate to serve American economic interests while ignoring how their policies affected the rest of the world. We served African interests exclusively and unapologetically. We located the African Gold Reserve Bank headquarters in Ouagadougou rather than a Western financial capital, symbolizing that African monetary sovereignty would be managed from African soil. The building was constructed using African materials, designed by African architects, and built by African workers. The vaults holding our gold reserves were engineered to highest security standards, with technology purchased from non-Western sources to prevent backdoors. Every aspect reinforced that this institution belonged to Africa and served Africa without any dependence on Western systems. Trade within the gold dinar zone exploded as common currency eliminated exchange rate risks and transaction costs that had constrained African commerce for decades. Intra-African trade, that had represented just 18% of total African trade under fragmented currency systems, grew to 34% as gold dinar made commerce seamless. Nigerian manufacturers sold to Kenyan retailers without currency conversion costs or exchange rate risks, South African mining companies supplied Egyptian factories directly without worrying that currency fluctuations would destroy their profit margins. Ghanaian agricultural exporters shipped to Moroccan food processors with prices denominated in the same currency. The monetary integration accelerated economic integration across all 54 African nations beyond what anyone had predicted possible. The elimination of currency conversion costs alone saved African businesses approximately $14 billion annually that had previously been extracted by Western banks as fees for converting between fragmented African currencies. A Nigerian exporter selling to Kenya had previously converted naira to dollars, then dollars to Kenyan shillings, paying fees at each conversion while banks captured the spread between buy and sell prices. Under the gold dinar system, the same transaction occurred in a single currency with zero conversion costs. That $14 billion in annual savings stayed in African businesses instead of enriching Western financial institutions. Exchange rate risk elimination was equally transformative for expanding intra-African commerce. Previously, an Ethiopian coffee exporter, agreeing to sell to South African buyers, faced the risk that currency fluctuations between birr and rand could eliminate their profit margin between contract signing and payment. This risk discouraged trade or required expensive hedging through Western banks that charged fees for the service. With both countries using gold dinars, exchange rate risk disappeared completely. Businesses could confidently engage in trade knowing that the price agreed in gold dinars would remain stable because both currencies were backed by the same gold standard. The trade expansion created network effects that multiplied benefits beyond the direct cost savings. As Nigerian manufacturers increased sales to Kenyan retailers, they achieved economies of scale that reduced production costs, making their products competitive in even more African markets. As South African mining companies developed supply relationships with Egyptian factories, they invested in specialized processing facilities that served those customers better than generic Western suppliers could. The deepening economic relationships built African supply chains that reduced dependence on imports from outside the continent. Specific industries experienced revolutionary transformations as monetary integration enabled business models that had been impossible under fragmented currency systems. African automobile manufacturing emerged as Kenyan assembly plants using South African steel, Nigerian rubber, Egyptian electronics, and Ghanaian textiles could source everything within the gold dinar zone without currency risk or conversion costs. These manufacturers produced vehicles tailored for African road conditions at prices African consumers could afford. Previously, African countries had imported all vehicles from Europe, America, or Asia, sending billions in currency out of the continent annually. African pharmaceutical manufacturing similarly benefited from monetary integration. South African companies produced active ingredients that Kenyan factories formulated into medicines, packaged using materials from Nigerian suppliers, and distributed through networks spanning all 38 gold dinar nations. The seamless currency enabled these complex supply chains to operate efficiently without the currency risk and conversion costs that had previously made African pharmaceutical manufacturing uncompetitive against imports. Africa began producing our own medicines rather than remaining dependent on Western pharmaceutical companies that charged exploitative prices. African agricultural processing industries expanded dramatically as monetary integration enabled farmers to sell to processors across national borders without currency complications. Ethiopian coffee farmers sold directly to Egyptian roasting facilities. Ivorian cocoa producers supplied Ghanaian chocolate manufacturers. Kenyan tea plantations served South African beverage companies. Previously, currency barriers had meant that African agricultural commodities were exported raw to Europe for processing, then imported back as finished products at much higher prices. The gold dinar system enabled Africa to capture the value-added processing rather than exporting it to Europe with our raw materials. The monetary integration also enabled African technology industries to achieve scale and specialization that had been impossible under fragmented markets. Nigerian software developers created banking applications deployed across all 38 gold dinar nations with uniform currency requirements. South African telecommunications companies built networks spanning multiple countries without worrying about currency-specific billing systems. Kenyan mobile money platforms expanded regionally because a single gold dinar standard meant they didn't need to customize for each national currency. The technology sector, which had struggled to compete with Western imports, suddenly became competitive through achieving continental scale. Financial services integration followed monetary integration as banks could now operate seamlessly across 38 nations using a single currency system. A South African bank could open branches in Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt without the complexity of managing multiple currency exposures and regulatory systems for each national currency. African banks that had previously focused only on their domestic markets suddenly operated regionally and competed effectively against Western banks that had dominated cross-border African banking. The competition improved services and reduced costs as African institutions no longer faced disadvantages from currency fragmentation. The construction industry experienced explosive growth as monetary integration enabled projects spanning multiple countries without currency risk. A Nigerian construction company could bid on Kenyan infrastructure projects knowing that costs and revenues would remain stable in gold dinars throughout multi-year construction periods. Ethiopian engineering firms partnered with South African material suppliers on Egyptian projects without worrying that currency fluctuations would destroy the economics. The Pan-African project scale that resulted allowed African construction companies to develop capabilities that had previously been monopolized by European and Chinese firms. Tourism industries across Africa benefited as travelers could move between countries without constantly exchanging currencies and losing money to conversion fees and unfavorable exchange rates. A tourist could travel from Nigeria to Kenya to South Africa to Egypt using the same gold dinars throughout, making African tourism more convenient and affordable. Tourism revenue that had leaked to Western banks through currency exchange fees now stayed within the African tourism industry. The improved economics meant African countries invested more heavily in tourism infrastructure, creating jobs and generating foreign exchange as tourists from outside Africa visited and exchanged their currencies for gold dinars. The monetary integration accelerated economic integration across all 54 African nations beyond what anyone had predicted because it enabled coordination in other policy areas. With 38 nations using common currency, they naturally coordinated trade policies to maximize benefits from their monetary union. Tariffs between gold dinar nations were progressively reduced and eliminated as countries recognized that protecting domestic industries made less sense when those industries could sell to billion-person markets using unified percent currency. The tariff elimination further accelerated trade growth beyond what currency integration alone would have achieved. Regulatory harmonization followed as countries recognized that divergent regulations created unnecessary barriers to the integrated market their common currency had created. Product standards were aligned so Nigerian manufacturers could sell across all 38 nations without modifying products for each market. Professional certifications were made portable so doctors, engineers, and other professionals could work anywhere in the gold dinar zone without requalifying. Business registration was simplified so companies could operate multinationally through streamlined processes. The regulatory integration multiplied the benefits of monetary integration. Infrastructure coordination accelerated as countries using common currency could more easily finance and implement cross-border projects. Railway networks were planned to connect major economic centers across national borders. Power grids were integrated to enable electricity trading between countries with surplus and deficit capacity. Telecommunications networks were upgraded to continental standards. All of this became more feasible when currency risk and conversion costs were eliminated through gold dinar adoption. Projects that had been blocked by currency complications suddenly became economically viable. The economic integration created powerful political pressure on the 16 African nations that had not yet joined the gold dinar system. Businesses in those countries faced disadvantages when competing with firms from gold dinar nations that enjoyed zero currency risk and conversion costs in their largest export markets. Workers in non-member countries earned incomes in fragmented currencies that were less stable and less useful than gold dinars. Consumers faced higher prices because their countries imported products with currency conversion costs built in rather than buying directly from African producers in gold dinars. The economic disadvantages created domestic political pressure to join the monetary union. Non-member countries also faced increasing isolation from African economic decision-making as gold dinar nations coordinated policies and negotiated as a bloc. When the 38 gold dinar nations negotiated trade agreements with China, India, or other external partners, they bargained collectively using their combined $3.8 trillion economy as leverage. Non-member African countries had to negotiate individually with far less bargaining power. When gold dinar nations coordinated industrial policies or infrastructure investments, non-member countries were excluded from the planning. The political isolation reinforced economic disadvantages and pressured holdout nations to join. The African Union increasingly focused its activities on supporting and expanding the gold dinar system, as leaders recognized this represented Africa's best opportunity for genuine economic independence. AU summits prioritized monetary integration discussions. Development programs were designed to support gold dinar nations' economic coordination. Political pressure was applied to non-member countries to join rather than remaining outposts of Western monetary control. The continental institution that had sometimes struggled to achieve concrete results found purpose and effectiveness in supporting monetary sovereignty. Western institutions and governments watched with alarm as the gold dinar system not only survived but thrived beyond their predictions. The IMF had forecast that African monetary union would collapse within 6 months due to lack of fiscal coordination and inevitable economic shocks. Instead, the system had expanded and strengthened. The World Bank had warned that gold-backed currency would constrain necessary monetary flexibility and strangle economic growth. Instead, growth had accelerated across gold dinar nations. Every Western prediction of failure had proven false, demonstrating that those predictions had been propaganda designed to discourage African monetary independence rather than honest economic analysis. European governments faced domestic political pressure as their own citizens questioned why Africa was prospering with gold-backed currency, while European economies struggled with inflation caused by unlimited money printing. If gold-backed currency worked for 38 African nations, why couldn't it work for European countries? The question threatened the entire paradigm of modern central banking based on unlimited fiat currency creation. European politicians dismissed African success as temporary or unsustainable, but they couldn't explain why or when it would fail. The cognitive dissonance grew as months passed and African monetary union continued succeeding. American economists wrote papers attempting to explain why the gold dinar success was illusory or wouldn't last. They claimed that African growth was driven by commodity price booms rather than monetary policy, ignoring that commodity prices hadn't particularly changed. They argued that African monetary union lacked the fiscal integration necessary for long-term stability, ignoring that the euro had survived for decades despite similar fiscal fragmentation. They predicted that a future economic shock would reveal the gold dinar's weaknesses, unable to specify what shock or why gold backing would fail when fiat currencies had consistently failed during shocks. The arguments were transparently desperate attempts to deny the obvious reality that African monetary independence was succeeding. Chinese and Indian observers took the African monetary experiment more seriously as they calculated the implications for the dollar-dominated global financial system. If an entire continent could successfully abandon the dollar and euro, could others follow? Would African success inspire Latin American monetary union? Could Asian nations accelerate their own currency diversification away from the dollar? The possibility that the gold dinar represented the beginning of global monetary system transformation rather than isolated African experiment worried Western powers but excited countries that had chafed under dollar hegemony. Middle Eastern oil producers particularly paid attention to African monetary independence, as they had long discussed but never implemented alternatives to pricing oil in dollars. The petrodollar system had forced all oil importing countries to hold dollars, creating artificial demand that enabled America to print unlimited money without consequences. But if African nations could successfully operate using gold-backed currency, could oil be priced in gold or baskets of currencies instead? The question threatened the foundation of American monetary hegemony more than Western commentators wanted to acknowledge. African success emboldened advocates for monetary reform within Western countries who had long argued that unlimited fiat currency creation caused inequality, instability, and unsustainable debt. They pointed to the gold dinar as proof that gold-backed currency could work in modern economies despite central banks' claims that gold standards were obsolete. Populist movements in Europe and America began demanding monetary systems that couldn't be manipulated by central banks to bail out wealthy financial institutions while impoverishing ordinary citizens through inflation. The gold dinar had become inspiration not just for developing countries seeking independence, but for Western citizens seeking honest money. The phenomenon terrified Western central banks and governments because it threatened the entire foundation of their power. For decades, they had convinced populations that fiat currency was necessary for modern economic management and that gold standards were primitive relics that would strangle growth. African success exposed those claims as lies designed to justify unlimited money printing that enriched financial elites while destroying middle-class savings through inflation. When ordinary Europeans saw Africans prospering with gold-backed money, they started questioning why their own savings were being devalued through central bank policies. Political movements emerged across Europe demanding return to gold-backed currencies or at least strict limits on money creation. In France, the National Rally Party incorporated monetary reform into their platform, arguing that if Africa could back currency with gold, so could France. In Italy, the Five Star Movement proposed a parallel gold-backed currency to compete with the euro. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany party demanded Bundesbank transparency about gold reserves and questioned why Germany couldn't have a gold-backed Deutsche Mark again if Africans could have gold dinars. The political pressure created existential threats to the European Central Bank's unlimited power. In America, the situation was equally threatening to establishment power. Ron Paul, who had advocated for gold-backed currency for decades, suddenly found his arguments vindicated by African success. His followers pointed to the gold dinar as proof that Federal Reserve propaganda about gold standards being impractical was false. Tea Party activists demanded audits of Fort Knox gold reserves and questioned why America couldn't back dollars with gold if African nations could. Progressive movements simultaneously criticized how Federal Reserve money printing had inflated asset prices that benefited wealthy while wages stagnated, using African monetary reform as example of alternative approaches. The bipartisan nature of Western monetary reform movements made them particularly dangerous to central bank power. Both right-wing nationalists angry about inflation and left-wing populists angry about inequality found common cause in demanding honest money that couldn't be manipulated to serve financial elites. The gold dinar provided concrete proof that alternatives to central bank fiat currency could work, undermining decades of propaganda claiming that unlimited money printing was necessary and inevitable. Western central banks faced legitimacy crises they had never anticipated would come from African monetary independence. Central bank officials responded with increasingly desperate propaganda trying to discredit the gold dinar system. The Federal Reserve Chair gave speeches claiming that African success was temporary and would collapse when they faced economic shocks, requiring monetary flexibility. The European Central Bank published papers arguing that gold-backed currencies constrained necessary stimulus during recessions. The Bank of England warned that returning to gold standards would cause deflation and depression, but these arguments rang hollow when Africans were visibly prospering with the exact system Western central banks claimed would cause catastrophe. Western financial media amplified central bank propaganda with articles predicting imminent gold dinar collapse. The Economist ran cover stories about Africa's monetary mistake despite zero evidence of problems. The Financial Times published opinion pieces by economists warning that gold backing would strangle African development. Bloomberg ran segments with analysts claiming the gold dinar would fail within a year, but as months passed and African economies continued growing faster under gold-backed currency than they ever had under Western fiat systems, the propaganda became obviously false. Media credibility suffered as their predictions kept failing to materialize. The desperation in Western propaganda revealed how threatened established powers felt by African monetary independence. If the gold dinar succeeded long-term, it would inspire other regions to abandon the dollar and euro. It would demonstrate that Western central bank policies served elite interests rather than economic necessity. It would prove that developing countries could escape monetary exploitation through coordination and determination. The implications terrified institutions whose power rested on monetary monopoly and the ability to print unlimited currency without consequences. African success threatened to unravel the entire Western-dominated global financial system. The transformation of African economies under the gold dinar system vindicated everything I had argued when launching Burkina Faso's monetary rebellion. We had proven that monetary sovereignty was achievable through coordination and determination rather than being an impossible dream as Western economists claimed. We had demonstrated that gold-backed currency worked better than European paper for African development, accelerating growth while providing stability. We had shown that economic integration accelerated when currency fragmentation was eliminated, enabling trade and investment that had been impossible under fragmented systems. We had built institutions that served African interests rather than depending on Western institutions designed to exploit us. We had recovered the independence and dignity that comes from controlling your own money rather than using currency printed in foreign capitals for foreign interests. Every metric validated the decision to abandon Western currencies and create the gold dinar. GDP growth across the 38 member nations averaged 6.4%, compared to 3.1% average growth under previous Western-dominated monetary systems. That acceleration reflected recovered monetary sovereignty, enabling pro-growth policies rather than austerity demanded to maintain Western currency pegs. Inflation averaged just 2.1% despite strong growth because gold backing prevented the excessive money printing that caused inflation under fiat systems. The combination of high growth and low inflation demonstrated superior economic performance under gold-backed African currency. Unemployment fell dramatically across gold dinar nations as economic integration created jobs and growth opportunities. Burkina Faso's unemployment dropped from 18% under the CFA franc to 9% under gold dinars. Nigeria saw unemployment fall from 23% to 14%. Egypt reduced unemployment from 11% to 7%. The job creation reflected expanding intra-African trade, investment in industries that had been uncompetitive under fragmented currencies, and repatriation of capital that created domestic opportunities. Africans were working and prospering rather than suffering unemployment under Western monetary systems. Poverty rates declined across the gold dinar zone as economic growth and job creation raised incomes for the poorest populations. Extreme poverty fell by an average of 8 percentage points across member nations within the first year of gold dinar operations. This dramatic reduction reflected not just growth, but more equitable distribution of growth benefits when monetary policy served African development rather than enabling wealth extraction by Western banks. Workers' wages increased in real terms because low inflation preserved purchasing power while employment growth gave workers bargaining leverage. The poor were benefiting rather than being left behind. Investment in African economies surged as the gold dinar system attracted both domestic and foreign capital seeking stable returns. Foreign direct investment into gold dinar nations increased by 43% as investors from China, India, and Middle Eastern countries recognized that gold-backed currency provided better protection than Western fiat currencies. Chinese companies invested heavily in manufacturing facilities to serve the billion-person integrated market that common currency created. Indian firms established regional headquarters to coordinate operations across multiple gold dinar nations seamlessly. Arab investors bought African bonds denominated in gold dinars rather than dollars, providing capital for infrastructure development. Domestic investment accelerated even more dramatically as capital that had previously fled to European banks returned home. African businesses could now borrow in gold dinars to finance expansion without exchange rate risks that had made borrowing in foreign currencies dangerous. African savers deposited money in African banks rather than moving funds to Europe because gold-backed currency provided better security than euro deposits. The repatriation of African capital meant that African savings financed African development rather than enriching European banks, while Africa begged for foreign investment. Infrastructure development exploded across the gold dinar zone as monetary integration enabled projects that had been economically impossible under fragmented currencies. Cross-border railways connected major economic centers without currency risk, complicating financing or operations. Regional power grids enabled electricity trading between countries with surplus and deficit capacity. Telecommunications networks were upgraded to continental standards supporting digital economy integration. Port facilities were expanded and modernized to handle growing intra-African trade volumes. Road networks were built connecting agricultural regions to processing facilities and markets. The infrastructure that had been starved for decades under Western monetary systems was finally being built with African capital freed from currency exploitation. Manufacturing industries that had been strangled by currency fragmentation and Western competition suddenly became viable under gold dinar integration. African automobile manufacturers assembled vehicles using components from multiple gold dinar nations without currency risks. African pharmaceutical companies produced medicines at costs far below Western imports. African electronics firms manufactured smartphones and computers competitive with imports. African textile producers supplied clothing to continental markets. African food processors turned regional agricultural products into consumer goods. The industrial development that had been promised but never delivered under Western monetary systems was occurring under African monetary sovereignty. Agricultural transformation followed as monetary integration connected farmers to processing facilities and markets efficiently. African farmers received fair prices for their products because they could sell directly to African processors using gold dinars rather than being forced to export raw commodities for dollars at depressed prices. African agricultural processing captured value-added production that had previously gone to European companies. African consumers bought African-produced food products rather than expensive imports. The agricultural sector that employed majority of Africans finally received the investment and market access necessary to escape poverty through productivity gains. Technology sectors emerged across the gold dinar zone as monetary integration provided market scale necessary for African tech companies to compete with Western giants. African software developers created applications serving billion-person markets in a single currency. African telecommunications companies built networks spanning multiple countries seamlessly. African fintech firms provided financial services to populations that Western banks had ignored. African e-commerce platforms connected buyers and sellers across borders without currency complications. The technology innovation that had been concentrated in Western countries was finally emerging in Africa under monetary sovereignty. Education systems improved as governments redirected resources from debt service and currency reserves to funding schools, universities, and training programs. Teacher salaries increased, attracting better talent into education. School construction accelerated, reducing overcrowding and improving learning environments. University research budgets grew, enabling African scholars to solve African problems rather than depending on Western research. Technical training institutes expanded, producing skilled workers for growing industries. The education improvements built human capital necessary for sustained development rather than leaving African youth without skills or opportunities. Healthcare systems strengthened as monetary sovereignty freed resources for building hospitals, training medical professionals, and purchasing equipment and medicines. Infant mortality rates fell across gold dinar nations as improved healthcare reached rural populations. Life expectancy increased as chronic disease treatment became accessible. Maternal mortality declined as women received proper prenatal and delivery care. Infectious disease control improved through better public health infrastructure. The healthcare improvements demonstrated that African governments could serve their populations effectively when freed from monetary exploitation that had starved social services for decades. The monetary integration created irreversible momentum toward comprehensive African economic integration as envisioned by Pan-African leaders for generations. Common currency was foundation for common market where goods, services, capital, and labor could move freely across borders. Common market would lead to coordinated industrial policy, where African nations worked together to build continental supply chains and competitive industries. Coordinated industrial policy would build continental supply chains that reduced dependence on imports and kept wealth circulating within Africa. Continental supply chains would create African economic power that could negotiate with external partners from position of strength rather than weakness. The gold dinar had initiated a transformation that would continue unfolding for decades, reshaping Africa's position in the global economy fundamentally and permanently. The transformation exceeded what even optimistic advocates had predicted because monetary sovereignty unlocked potential that had been suppressed for generations. Africans had always possessed the human resources, natural resources, and entrepreneurial spirit necessary for prosperity. What we lacked was control over our monetary systems and economic policies. Western-imposed currency systems had enabled capital flight, constrained policy choices, and extracted wealth through inflation and manipulation. Freeing ourselves from those systems released entrepreneurial energy and development potential that immediately manifested in accelerated growth, job creation, and poverty reduction. African leaders who had been skeptical about monetary rebellion now admitted I had been right. Presidents who had warned that abandoning Western currencies would cause economic catastrophe now celebrated gold dinar success in their countries. Finance ministers who had predicted isolation from global markets now reported record foreign investment and trade. Central bankers who had insisted that gold backing would constrain necessary flexibility now acknowledged that monetary discipline had delivered better outcomes than fiat currency manipulation. The vindication was complete and undeniable. African monetary independence worked better than Western monetary dependence in every measurable way. I recognize that sustaining this transformation required continuing to expand the system to all 54 African nations without exception. 16 countries remaining outside the gold dinar zone created vulnerabilities that Western powers could exploit. They could use those countries as bases for currency manipulation, providing dollars and euros that could be smuggled into gold dinar nations to undermine our currency. They could conduct monetary subversion, bribing African officials to sabotage gold dinar systems from within. They could wage economic warfare against the gold dinar system, using the 16 non-member countries as platforms for attacks. They could point to non-member countries as examples that African monetary union wasn't truly continental, claiming that holdout nations proved some Africans rejected the system. They could maintain hope that the system would fracture if they could pressure a few members to leave and return to Western monetary control. The 16 holdout nations represented strategic vulnerabilities that needed elimination. Most were small countries with particularly close ties to former colonial powers. Djibouti hosted French and American military bases and faced enormous pressure to maintain dollar and euro usage. Mauritius had built its economy around offshore financial services in dollars for wealthy foreigners and feared gold dinar adoption would kill that industry. Seychelles depended heavily on European tourism and worried that currency change would discourage visitors. Equatorial Guinea's dictator received support from Western oil companies in exchange for maintaining dollar-based contracts. Each holdout had specific reasons for resisting, but all represented potential entry points for Western subversion. Western intelligence agencies actively worked to maintain these holdouts as footholds in Africa. CIA operatives in Djibouti distributed propaganda claiming the gold dinar would collapse and countries should stick with dollars. French intelligence in Mauritius funded politicians who opposed joining the monetary union. British intelligence in Seychelles planted media stories warning about costs of transition. Spanish intelligence in Equatorial Guinea supported the dictator's resistance to monetary integration. The subversion was systematic and well-funded because Western powers understood that complete African monetary unity would eliminate their ability to divide and exploit the continent. Achieving unanimity across all 54 African nations would eliminate those vulnerabilities and cement African monetary sovereignty as permanent continental reality that could never be reversed. Every African country using gold dinars meant no footholds for Western monetary control remained. It meant complete continental consensus behind monetary independence that Western powers couldn't undermine by exploiting divisions. It meant the system had achieved critical mass where reversal was practically impossible even if Western pressure intensified to unprecedented levels. Every additional nation joining the gold dinar made the system stronger and more resilient. Network effects meant that the value of monetary union increased exponentially with each new member. Going from 38 to 54 nations wouldn't just add 16 countries, it would multiply the benefits by integrating those nations into the continental market and eliminating fragmentation. A Mauritius that joined would connect East African and Southern African commerce more efficiently. A Djibouti that joined would integrate Horn of Africa trade into continental systems. Every holdout that joined strengthened the whole more than their individual economic size suggested. The goal of total continental monetary sovereignty became my focus as the 38-nation system stabilized and proved its viability beyond any doubt. I began intensive diplomatic campaigns targeting each of the 16 holdout nations individually with strategies tailored to their specific situations. For countries worried about transition costs, I offered technical assistance and temporary financing from the African Gold Reserve Bank. For nations dependent on Western support, I coordinated alternative partnerships with China, India, and Middle East that would replace lost Western backing. For governments facing domestic opposition, I helped build public support through education campaigns showing benefits their neighbors enjoyed. For dictators resisting change, I applied pressure through isolation from African institutions and coordination. I personally visited each holdout nation's capital to meet with leaders and explain why remaining outside the gold dinar zone was unsustainable. I showed them the economic data proving that member nations grew faster, created more jobs, reduced poverty more effectively, and attracted more investment than holdout countries. I demonstrated that isolation from African economic integration would only worsen as the 38-nation bloc continued deepening cooperation. I warned that Western support they depended on was temporary and contingent, while African solidarity could be permanent and reliable. I offered partnership in building African prosperity or isolation as outposts of failed Western systems. The arguments proved persuasive when combined with visible evidence that the gold dinar system worked beyond anyone's predictions. Leaders could see their neighbors prospering while their own countries struggled under Western monetary systems that extracted wealth and constrained development. Citizens demanded to know why they remained poor, while nearby countries thrived under monetary independence that delivered tangible benefits. Businesses pressured governments to join so they could access integrated African markets without currency conversion costs, destroying competitiveness. The combination of evidence, incentives, and pressure moved several holdout nations toward reconsidering their positions. The path to complete continental monetary sovereignty was opening faster than Western powers could block. The first breakthrough came when Mauritius announced it was joining the gold dinar system despite its offshore financial services industry built around dollars. The decision shocked Western observers who had assumed Mauritius would never abandon the dollar because its economy depended on providing dollar banking services to foreigners. But Mauritius's leaders calculated that access to the $3.8 trillion gold dinar market mattered more than maintaining dollar offshore banking that was declining anyway as Western regulators cracked down. The symbolic importance was enormous because Mauritius had been considered the least likely holdout to join, yet economic logic proved stronger than Western pressure. Mauritius's finance minister explained the decision in a press conference that humiliated Western institutions. He stated bluntly that Mauritius had watched neighboring countries grow rich under the gold dinar, while Mauritius's economy stagnated, serving Western banks. He calculated that joining the monetary union would increase Mauritius's GDP growth from 2% to 6% within 2 years through expanded trade and investment. He noted that offshore banking generated just 8% of GDP, while integration with gold dinar nations would transform the entire economy. The math was simple. Prosperity through African integration beat poverty through Western servitude. The decision triggered immediate responses from other holdout nations whose populations had been watching and waiting. Seychelles announced within a week that it too would join the gold dinar system, calculating that tourists would come regardless of currency used, and that economic integration with Africa mattered more than maintaining euros to please European visitors. Seychelles had been paralyzed by fear that currency change would scare tourists, but Mauritius's decision proved that fear was Western propaganda rather than economic reality. Seychelles' president declared that his country was choosing African prosperity over European approval, and that decision was permanent. Djibouti presented a harder case because American and French military bases created enormous pressure to maintain dollar and euro usage. The United States threatened to relocate its base if Djibouti joined the gold dinar, believing that would force compliance. But I coordinated a response demonstrating that threats were empty. China offered to triple its investment in Djibouti's port facilities if Djibouti joined the gold dinar zone. The United Arab Emirates pledged $2 billion in development assistance. Turkey promised military cooperation that could replace American and French presence. Suddenly, Djibouti had alternatives that were better than Western bases that brought minimal economic benefit while constraining sovereignty. Djibouti's president convened his cabinet and presented the options. Maintain dollars and euros to keep Western military bases that paid minimal rent and employed few Djiboutians, or join the gold dinar and receive massive Chinese, Emirati, and Turkish investment plus access to integrated African markets. The economic calculation was obvious. Western military presence provided strategic benefits to America and France while giving Djibouti almost nothing. Gold dinar membership would transform the economy through investment and trade. The cabinet voted unanimously to join the monetary union and gave Western militaries 1 year to renegotiate base terms or leave. The American reaction was fury and threats. State Department officials warned that Djibouti was making a grave mistake that would cost American support. Defense Department representatives suggested that losing the base would harm Djibouti's security. Treasury officials hinted at financial sanctions, but the threats rang hollow because Djibouti had secured alternatives and American leverage had evaporated. When Djibouti announced gold dinar membership and demanded new base agreements, America scrambled to renegotiate rather than lose a strategic facility. The power dynamic had reversed completely. Africa was dictating terms rather than accepting Western demands. Equatorial Guinea represented perhaps the toughest case because the dictator derived personal wealth from dollar-denominated oil contracts with Western companies that supported his regime. Joining the gold dinar would require renegotiating those contracts and potentially losing Western backing that kept him in power despite human rights abuses. But I applied pressure through isolation that made his position untenable. The African Union announced that Equatorial Guinea would be suspended from all continental institutions unless it joined the monetary union within 6 months. African nations stopped cooperating on security matters, leaving the dictator vulnerable to internal threats. African banks refused to process his regime's transactions, complicating money laundering. Simultaneously, I offered the dictator a way out that protected his interests. Join the gold dinar system, renegotiate oil contracts in gold-backed currency, and receive African support for regime stability in exchange for marginal governance improvements. The deal wasn't ideal because it meant accommodating a dictator, but it was necessary to achieve complete continental monetary sovereignty. The dictator calculated that African backing was more reliable than Western support that was increasingly conditional on human rights performance. He announced Equatorial Guinea would join the gold dinar and began renegotiating oil contracts. Western oil companies protested but ultimately accepted gold-denominated contracts rather than losing access to resources. The remaining holdout nations fell like dominoes as the path of least resistance shifted from maintaining Western currencies to joining the gold dinar. Cabo Verde joined after calculating that tourism from gold dinar nations mattered more than pleasing European visitors. São Tomé and Príncipe joined after Portuguese pressure failed and African incentives succeeded. Comoros joined after France threatened but couldn't deliver on threats. Lesotho joined after South Africa demanded integration as condition for economic cooperation. Eswatini joined after regional isolation became unbearable. The holdouts were surrendering not just to pressure but to obvious economic logic that joining served their interests better than resisting. Each new member strengthened the monetary union's network effects exponentially. When Mauritius joined, East African trade suddenly integrated with Southern African and South Asian connections through Mauritian ports. When Djibouti joined, Red Sea commerce connected seamlessly to continental gold dinar markets. When Cabo Verde joined, Atlantic trade routes integrated with West African economies. Every addition created multiplicative benefits rather than simple additions because integrated networks are exponentially more valuable than fragmented systems. The gold dinar zone wasn't just getting bigger, it was getting dramatically more powerful with each expansion. By the time the final holdout nations were negotiating membership terms, the question wasn't whether they would join but how quickly. The last four countries, Eritrea, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Liberia, all announced simultaneously that they would join the gold dinar system within 90 days. The synchronized announcement was coordinated to demonstrate African unity and deny Western powers the opportunity to pressure individual nations. All four recognized that remaining outside the 50-nation bloc was economically suicidal and politically unsustainable. Their citizens demanded integration. Their businesses required it. Their governments accepted reality.